All right. Hey, class, we're continuing our discussion of literature of the 19th century or the 1800s. All right. So we talked about the five sociocultural shifts that our anthology posits during the 19th century or that it observes. Um, so now we're going to talk about dissonance between idealized femininity and female reality. All right. So there's a disconnect between these two things, between that idealization of what women, of what some women should be, and the reality of how many women actually are, or what they lived through during this time period. So the Madonna whore complex that we discussed previously, in the Middle Ages and or the Renaissance, that kind of, on one hand, we have, the temptress role of women, that people see, as started like from that Eve ideology from the Garden of Eden as Eve, eating of the fruit, and so seducing men to eat of the fruit, and so then bringing that fall of humanity, bringing sin into the world, etc. Versus Madonna, Mother of God, that was particularly a big the cult of Mariolatry, it was very big during the Middle Ages with chivalry, right? And putting women on a pedestal. Women are innocent. They need to be protected. That whole dueling paradigm of women. So you got these two different poles, right? And women, the reality of women, obviously is somewhere in between, right? Anyway, the Madonna whore complex persisted and perhaps even refined itself in the 1800s. The cult of Mariolatry, that worship of women, or, the Virgin Mary, right? As perfect, innocent, needed to be protected. And the chivalric patroness devolved into the concept of the angel in the house, a role that upper and middle class socioeconomic women, or upper and middle socioeconomic class women, were to assume, through self-effacement and self-abnegation to the interests of others in the house. Now, this concept was embodied in a poem by Charles Patmore at the time, and he termed it the angel in the house. So that's where we get that term, where women were confined to the home and they were the angel, the innocent that needed to be protected. So that's where you have a lot of laws that come up during this time period, to protect women. All right, quote unquote, protect women, but more, it was like keeping them confined, right, and limiting what they could do. Right, as we had all throughout this time period, but like sometimes it was more of a socio economic pretext. Now it's like actually a, more laws came about to codify it, right, in legal terms. So the angel's life was to be dutiful to those around her. In other words, women's life, right? They had this incredible sense of duty, that was thrust upon them by society. Even lower socioeconomic class women participated in this self-abnegating tradition by often working longer, harder hours than their male counterparts in the factories, believe it or not. And of course, these women then went home to children and husbands who still had to be served dinner, have clothing made, and have all the normal domestic tasks performed by these women who just finished long days at the factory. Yeah, so here's where, the candle starts burning at both ends for women. I mean, as it has, for so many years, but like really now they're working, some of them, in the factories and coming home and still doing all the domestic chores and roles. Upper and middle socioeconomic class women still did not work. So the pressure to marry was enormous, without other means for women to support themselves, right? These women still didn't have, the upper and middle socioeconomic class women tended not to work, and so they relied on the support of a husband. So obviously that intensifies the pressure to marry. The fear that unmarried women would become fallen by leading a life of looseness or prostitution without a husband to support and restrain them, betrayed the old Eve association. So we still see it, right? In other words, the opposite pole of the Madonna whore dichotomy that rears its ugly head that, well, if women, as innocent and virginal as they are not married, then, they may swing to the other end of the pendulum and become that whore pole of the conflict. That was the fear, right? I'm not saying that is what would happen, but that was the fear that if they did not marry, they would become fallen women, right? Because they weren't protected by a husband. And so then what would they do to support themselves, right? If there wasn't education for women and a lot of easy available job opportunity for them. Women did write during the 19th century, as evidenced by the numerous female writers who literally exploded onto the literary scene during the 1800s, because we have all these factories that can now mass produce literature, right? And so with all of that mass production of literature comes many opportunities for women to write. And if there's leisure time for women because of the mechanization of the labor force, so that means more downtime, or even in the home, we have mechanization coming in to be able to give more leisure time to women. So then with leisure time came, they can learn to read and write, and they can then want to read, right? Because they can read. So you have a more of an audience expanding in women too. And also, there's more education available during this time. Colleges started opening their doors to women, not till like the latter half of the 1800s, but there were a few that were allowing women to be admitted. I think Oberlin was the first in the United States. I can't remember the exact date off the top of my head, but it started happening in the 1800s. And also, there was the Elementary Education Act that happened in the latter half of the 1800s. So America was guaranteeing an education to women because they wanted children to be educated at least through elementary school. So that, I think that came about like 1869. And so we have the whole population learning to read and write if they went to an elementary school. And America started realizing it's important for our population to become educated. We will become more economically secure if more people have an education of sorts, right? Because if people aren't educated, they're going to tend to be poorer because they can't find good employment. So it's to America's benefit to educate its people. So with that priority shift comes a more educated population, comes a greater reading population, right? So that opens the door for women writers to move in and write more, right? So I'm not saying that there still wasn't that pressure for women not to write. There still was a pressure, but the opportunity and greed drove these things, right? Drove that expansion of opportunity to women. Women did write, okay? However, society still looked down upon women who wrote and earned money by writing. So it was still looked down upon. Thus, female writers often published anonymously, as Jane Austen did. Jane Austen, everybody knows her name now. But when she first started writing and publishing, she published anonymously. She did not use her name. Or women often might, if they did publish, they either would publish anonymously or use a male pseudonym. So people thought that they were men. As in the case of Charlotte Bronte, who wrote under the name of Currer Bell, and her sister Anne Bronte, who wrote under the name of Acton Bell, and her sister Emily Bronte, who wrote under the name of Ellis Bell. Marianne Evans also wrote under the male pseudonym of George Eliot. Aurora Dupin, a French writer, wrote under the name of Georges Sand, or George. That's what that name looks like, etc. It kept going on. But without actual legal prohibitions and with greater access to education, women at least now had the ability to write, and write they did. Although women had the legal right to write, they still lacked numerous basic rights for most of the 19th century. For instance, women still did not have very many property rights. Often property was willed to the eldest male child, and in the absence of a male child, to some distant male relative, rather than to a man's wife and or female children. And you saw that being a major plot point of Jane Austen's novels. Often the estates that the families had would be willed either to the eldest male or to a distant male relative. You even see that in Downton Abbey. If any of you watch Downton Abbey, at the beginning of Downton Abbey, which is set in England, the huge estate there was going to be going to the male cousin, not to the three girls that were the children. So yeah, this is a huge pressure for women to marry, and to marry that male heir, so that they would have support. All right, so women during the 1900s still could not divorce their husbands and were not awarded custody of their children if their husbands chose to divorce them, until at least the mid-1800s. Of course, women were not allowed to vote during this time. Women were not allowed to attend college except for Oberlin, as I said, until the second half of the 1800s, when some colleges started to open their doors, or when a few women's colleges started to spring up. So colleges devoted entirely to the education of women. Now, this is during the latter half of the 1800s. In fact, undergraduate women were not even allowed to attend Princeton University until as late as 1969. So that's until the 1900s, until the latter half of the 1900s, 1969. Women could not attend Princeton University, just up the road. Yeah. So pretty shocking and surprising when you think about that. Yeah. So education is a humongous factor in affecting poverty, affecting the ability of women to be employed, affecting the ability of women to write and even to vote, right? So much is accomplished through education. So I'm all proud of you that you are here being educated, because that is the true pathway to change lives. All right. That is the end of our overview of literature in the 19th century, or the 1800s. We're going to next visit the lives of our female writers that we're studying this week, those writers from that early part of the 19th century. All right, I'll meet you back for that. Enjoy.